This is Housebound. I'm Chris.
I'm Holly.
I'm Ashlyn.
I'm Greg.
And you're invited.
Housebound へようこそ。私たちが会社を必要としていたために作成したポッドキャストです。No início de 2020, quando começamos a entrar em bloqueio global devido ao vírus Covid-19.
Convenimos et fecimos soc podcast via conjuncta manere.
En él, hablamos de las cosas que tenemos en la cabeza.
And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about languages.
That was jicky.
Do you have a translation for that?
Yeah, I have so much translation for that. And this is going to be a lot more complicated to edit together than it is going to be to actually listen to. But let me paraphrase. Welcome to Housebound, a podcast we made because we needed company. At the beginning of 2020, when we started going into a global lockdown due to the COVID-19 virus, we came together and made this podcast as a way to stay connected to each other. In this podcast, we talk about things that are on our minds. And today, as I've said, we are going to talk a little bit about languages. So I think each of us, jury's out on Ashlyn because I can't remember for sure, but I think each of us has studied or at least taken an interest in one or more languages in our lifetime. For myself, I took 3 years of Japanese in high school, and I still have all the notes in case I ever decided that I wanted to brush up on it. And Holly and I even started using that little Duolingo app for a little while to
fun.
Teach ourselves. Were you doing Spanish or were you doing Japanese as well?
I was doing Japanese because we had grand plans. We were like, we'll learn Japanese and then we'll go to Japan and then we'll know how to say all the things to the people in Japan. And then we did it for like 3 weeks.
Or at least our telephone numbers.
Yeah. And then we did it for like 3 weeks and then we stopped doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Adulting is hard.
Adulting is hard.
No. And Greg, you are currently taking some classes in Hebrew, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Biblical Hebrew. So it's more of a Shakespearean version of Hebrew than modern Hebrew. So
that's too bad.
Yeah, if you spoke to somebody today who speaks modern Hebrew, they would be like, I get what you're saying, but you sound really funny. So, yeah.
I can't even imagine somebody coming up and speaking to me like Shakespearean playwright. Like,
yeah.
I don't know if I would be able to understand them. Shakespeare wrote very differently than how we write.
Very differently, so yeah.
Oh, totally.
That's interesting.
Ashlyn, is there a specific language that you have? Like I said, I think I'm blanking on you. I feel like I have one in my mind, but that might not be one that you've ever particularly mentioned. So I'd just rather you come out and say it.
That's fair. When I was at the University of Saskatchewan, I took 6 credits of Cree, Plains Cree, but that was specific.
Yes, that was what I was thinking of.
And 6 credits at the U of S basically amounts to like 2 semesters, 1 full year of Cree. But what that got me in Cree language was very little.
Yeah.
And why is that? Is it because it's a particularly difficult language to learn?
No, that was 100% the instructor.
Oh, that's too bad.
I feel the same way. I took Spanish in university just for... I can't remember if it was 1 semester or 2 semesters, but same thing. I don't think that I learned all that much. Although sometimes when I see Spanish written somewhere, I can figure out what it's trying to tell me, or at least the subject of the sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I wouldn't be able to translate something, but I can usually be like, that's a word I know, or that's a verb I know. But I think French helps with that too, because I took French in high school a little bit until I was allowed to stop. Yeah. Well, Yes, that's a whole different story. But our French teacher wasn't very nice, and so I didn't want to be there.
That's fair.
Yeah, but French and Spanish have a lot of the same words and translations, so or similar ones.
Yeah, apart from biblical Hebrew, I was in French immersion for, I think, a year. And that was interesting. Yeah. And then I also took a bunch of years of French over in North Africa because they speak French in Tunisia, which was the neighboring country. So they had French and Arabic classes that they taught, but it wasn't that weird Canadian French. It was like the authentic French was how they would,
French?
actual French. Yeah. So,
Real
but
French.
yeah, but there too, I don't really remember much of it. It was many years of it, but like, yeah. Tu vas, tu vas, il va, nous allons, vous avez. I think that's the verb for let's go. So.
Très mal.
Vamonos. Let's
Vámonos.
go.
Yeah.
That's Spanish. I
there
don't
we
know
go.
that from university. I know that from Dora the Explorer. Thank you
there we
very
go.
much, my nieces, for being obsessed with Dora the Explorer. Was being in French immersion absolutely terrifying all the time? Because that's what I think French immersion schools, that like I can't just talk when I ask a question. Like I have to know how to ask a question in order to ask the question. And the question is about how to ask the question. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think like there was some amount of like a little bits of English that were allowed in at least the class that I was in, but I think it was a lot of just pointing and grunting. I don't know.
A real
that's
educational
funny.
year.
Yeah.
A week year for Greg.
Yeah.
Yes, in elementary school, I also had French immersion classes, we just called them French classes. And I think maybe grade 7 or grade 8, we might have stopped doing that altogether. For some reason, I remember not doing it for a few years near the end, but that could just be because I blanked it out. I feel as though we learned the same things over and over every year, which was both good because it meant that I knew what we were being taught. Like I didn't have to try terribly hard. I kind of felt a little bit comfortable with those same things, but it was also frustrating because as students that spoke predominantly English, and this was one class of the day where it was kind of the only class in school where you really had to memorize things all the time. It was like being constantly in the middle of a test. Because with math, you can just look at the numbers and you either understand the math or you don't. You just kind of do it. With science and history, they're explaining things to you. And yeah, when there comes to be a quiz, you have to remember your notes, I guess, whatever. Again, I can't remember what we did in elementary school regards to that, but we definitely took tests. So we definitely had to remember things. And I think when I thought about French class or just another language in general, it was like you had to remember, like Holly was saying, you had to think before you could say something in which you might not already know how to form a sentence. You had to, if you didn't even know how to say it in English, you didn't even know how to ask your question, like, teach me about that thing that's in the middle there. I can't remember the name of it. And so then suddenly you have to say that in French or any other language. So I think that it wasn't a bad thing for the teachers or for the school curriculum to encourage us to learn some of that. I mean, with living in Canada, French is one of the languages. But in high school, when we had a choice and we could either do more French, or in our school, we could do German or Japanese. And in other schools, they could do, I think, Japanese or Spanish. It was more enjoyable when you could actually learn of your own accord than being forced into a room once or twice a week and taught that students are like small beings, which are elves. And so you can remember the word student in French because it's elve or something like that.
Oh, weird.
That's weird.
I'm not wrong.
Is that the actual word?
Isn't it? It's like ELEVS. Here, I'll pull it up on Google Translate here.
Students. Élèves.
Elevs.
Yeah, so elf. It's
Small.
spelt like elves.
Yeah, my only elementary school French, I think I took from only until grade 6 or so. But our French teacher, I don't think she necessarily loved her job. And so I walked away with 0 additional French.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to be pretty common here, I would say, in the prairies.
Mm-hmm. I remember stuff, but more like conversational things or like songs, like Je suis une pizza. You know, it was a very hit song in, grade 7 or whatever that was. So
I was singing a Spanish song 2 days ago in the morning that I learned in El Salvador when I was in grade 11, and I'm 32 now. So that is a very long time ago. And I was like, I can't believe I still know these words. And I know that they're the right words because I know the song in English as well. And I was just like, man, this is crazy. But yeah, definitely, if you can put it to song, like to music, I remember that way better.
Well, I think that's why, even in English, and also I've learned in Hebrew, there's an alphabet song, that you have this little jingle that helps you memorize the letters of the alphabet and in what order. So, I think singing just attaches it to, helps you remember just by attaching it. And actually, how many times do we, even just in English, there's so many song lyrics that we know, not necessarily because we've actually taken the time to sit down and have a piece of paper and memorize it and rewrite it, but it's because of the fact that we've listened to it over and over, right? So, yeah.
If you're listening to this from outside of Canada, Saskatoon is a city which we all live in that is kind of pretty smack dab in the center of Saskatchewan, which is one of the prairie provinces. So also kind of smack dab in the center of Canada. And you grow up kind of isolated from the coasts, and especially not knowing that French is a second language, but not having much.
There's no practical experience with it.
Yeah, not having much immersion in it, for lack of better words.
Yeah.
Well, except for maybe Greg. And
hey, the other side of the cereal box, everyone has that experience.
There's lots of opportunities to read French where we are, but there's not a lot of opportunities to speak it and hear it, which I think is too bad, really.
Yeah. And now that we are coming into a time in our country where history is becoming a very mainstream focus for a lot of people, and we're finding out really just exactly how diverse our country is. I'm finding that in our city, Saskatoon again, we have these other languages showing up in places which are catching me kind of by surprise. So a few weeks ago, I saw a vehicle that was driving around that was, I'm assuming, advertising itself as some kind of business, but I don't understand what kind of business it was because it was all in either Mandarin or Cantonese or one of those very many languages that to me looks very similar, and I would be unable really to tell exactly apart from other similar languages, let alone be able to read it. And then a few years ago, I started noticing there was these pieces of what I later found out were just art installations on a couple of the main streets downtown and in our kind of core area of the city that I wasn't sure what they were. I thought they looked kind of artsy. I thought maybe they were signs for a business that was just kind of a hole in the wall business that couldn't get signage on the street. But it turns out that they are of the Cree language. And it was both surprising and unsurprising for me to see. Surprising because I had not grown up with Indigenous language as a very formative part of my understanding of where I live and the country I live in and the people that live here. But it was also unsurprising for that same reason, because of where I live and the people that I know now as an adult that live here. And like I mentioned, the historical aspect of it that's coming into play now. And so it was cool to see these different representations. I should note that vehicle did have a Saskatchewan license plate on it. So I don't know that it was from Saskatoon, but I know that for sure it wasn't just somebody was doing some like trip and they had boated it over to Canada and then was driving through Canada. So I did as much research as I could with as little information I had on that. But and then when I think back to my childhood, I didn't grow up with cable television, and I didn't grow up with shows like nowadays you would think of something like Dora that teaches kids Spanish. Very simple Spanish, but Spanish nonetheless. And I'm sure that there are other shows now that do that with other languages. In fact, I think there's a Chinese one, and I'm blanking on the name of it, and Chinese might be just an umbrella term. So I apologize for anybody that knows what the show is actually about, but it's for a different culture, which is the cool part. And now you have these kids running around that kind of have this rudimentary understanding of these different languages, which is way more than I had when I was a kid. But the one thing that I can think of that kind of slipped in and out of my circles growing up was ASL. And that was something that was really cool to me because you got to do things with your hands. And so I think as a kid, that's probably what impressed me the most about it. But over the years, there's been maybe a handful of scenarios where I feel like, oh, that could have been useful to know even something simple. And it always makes me think immediately back to learning another language. And not that that's a requirement for living in Canada or anywhere really, but I guess maybe the one question that I have about second languages is, do we, as people living in a country where there's such a variety of people from all over the world, cultures from everywhere, is it even worth our time to focus on one language and try to get an understanding of that so we could maybe communicate with somebody? Or is it not worth it because there's just so many different cultures that you always run into somebody that you can't communicate with? And it's just nice to know, like, is it just a nice feeling, nice thought to have, like, yeah, maybe I could learn a language one time. Like, I don't think we have any obligation to, but do you think that it's important, or do you think that it's something that's worth pursuing, learning another language? And maybe you have your own experience that you want to kind of talk about.
I think what's interesting is that question definitely is framed in like a North American Western context, whereas like other cultures around the world, you generally have to at least learn English in order to, like, if you want to, like, just because of the fact that like business and all sorts of like trade, like market trading, like so much is done in English. Like English is not a great language. I'll just say that right out, right? Like, it's a pretty poor language, and it's like
it's not easy. Yeah,
no, it's not easy. There's no real consistency of rules. Vocab's all over the place, and it's just like, it's not a really nice language. And so I feel for people who have to learn it, but yeah, and somehow I think it's mostly due to colonization and all that, which is unfortunate, but it's become like one of like the prominent languages. And there are much more nicer sounding languages. Like Spanish sounds really nice. I don't know, but English, not so much. So I think like in other communities, and, we might have some listeners who are out there, they actually have to, they don't really have a choice in terms of, oh, can I potentially learn another language? It's like, nah, I probably need to learn this English and just buckle down and get her done. So, but yeah, I think for us here in North America, at least how I frame it, even if like I don't end up meeting a ton of people, I think learning another language is cool because it allows you to be able to have that moment of connection where somebody else who speaks that language would not expect that you would like vice versa. I think we always expect people will just know English. We'll go to other countries and expect them to know English, right? Or like we will.
Yeah,
we'll
at least be able to point you in the right direction.
Where do I go?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, I don't speak English, or they'll say that in their language or whatever. And so, but you just kind of expect that, oh yeah, especially touristic countries, you know? So, whereas they will always, when other people come to English speaking countries, they'll typically, they're not going to tend to speak their own language at you when they're asking a question. They'll try at least to say it in English, right? So, yeah.
I think it's really interesting to learn a second language, not even for the literal communication, but the understanding of a different culture. Like, language reflects so much about what a culture believes and holds value in. I think it's interesting to study other languages because it can show you a lot about that. Help you understand other people just by speaking like them. People talk about, oh, I stopped thinking in my native language and now I think in this secondary language because I use it more. And their like mindsets have shifted for what they feel like is important. And language has a lot to do with that, just because of the way you use the language to express your feelings and stuff and ideas. So I think it's a super good idea to learn another language just for that, the insight into other people groups.
Are you a fellow creative and you're asking yourself, where did they get that absolutely banging intro music for their podcast because you want some for your own project? Well, we found it on Soundstripe, a royalty-free music licensing site with thousands of songs and updates to that library nearly each week. Even better than their high-quality content is their sound effects and stock video libraries that they've just added. And better still, you can get 10% off your first subscription when you use our coupon code Housebound10. That's Housebound10. That's it. Check out all that Soundstripe has to offer today by heading to soundstripe.com or clicking the link in the description. Happy creating!
Yeah, I think I agree with Holly that learning a new language can teach you a lot about some of the beliefs and customs and practices of that particular culture. But that being said, there is presently no language that I am learning or have a desire to learn.
Me, I am currently
not even
also
English.
Not.
Yeah.
So, like, one thing I really enjoyed with learning Cree was that most languages have like genders, like such as French, it's really strong in everything is either male or female. And we're all at least somewhat familiar with French. But in Cree, everything is either animate or inanimate.
That's really interesting.
But what they determine to be animate or inanimate isn't necessarily what scientifically you would consider to be animate or inanimate. So, like rocks, like large rocks, are animate, but like a pebble is inanimate. But they have this greater sense in Cree that like the earth is animate. And so a lot of stuff that's like connected to the earth or connected to the ground or sort of part of the ecosystem that's around you would be part of the animate world. And so it was really interesting to learn, and I found that really fascinating, but a lot of memorization as well.
That's really cool.
That's very neat.
Yeah.
Those art installations, this is slightly off topic, but those art installations that Chris was talking about that are Cree, when I first saw them, I thought, oh, this looks really cool, like a sci-fi movie or something. The Cree language just looks so neat to me. I, of course, have zero idea what it says, but it just looked super duper space agey.
Written Cree is actually a little bit controversial because Cree is an oral language. It's not a written language. And so when English-speaking people colonized this area, they created syllabics for the Cree language, but most of it, if Cree people do read Cree, most of them actually read it in like I want to say Roman numerals, but whatever it's called, the Roman way of writing out letters, where the long E has like an E with a line over top of it.
Oh.
Stuff like that. So that is what...
the Greek alphabet?
Yeah. I think so.
It might just be the phonetic Roman alphabet.
Something. But yeah. And so majority, at least that's what I remember from my class, is majority of people who would be able to read Cree would read it like that. And so that's how all of the dictionaries in my class were in those like Roman written vowels. And that's how we wrote out Cree and did presentations in Cree and stuff like that. So those syllabics are starting to be used more to take out more of the English influence, but even the history of the syllabics, it doesn't originate 100% from Cree speaking people. So it's a little bit controversial, because Cree ideally should just be spoken.
Interesting.
If you want to get back down to like the original roots of the language.
I think that is the other interesting part of language, is that, I think we often think of it as one unified whole, but to understand that for a long time, a lot of people groups, all they had was the oral side of things and not actually anything written down, really, right? And so the whole writing down, it used to be that you passed on information by just telling stories, right? And telling it to your kids so that they would then tell it to their kids. And that was how things in history kept passing along. And so, whereas I think nowadays, I think we're so used to just being able to open up our phones and have a bunch of stuff that's recorded for us on the internet right there in English that we can then read, right? So,
web pages that automatically translate for you and things like that too.
Yeah.
So, that's
you're
crazy.
not going to get that into Cree.
No.
Yeah, when we had I think we had a whole class of Japanese students that came over and spent a day at our school. It was like an exchange class of some sort, but none of us were hosting them, so I'm not sure exactly what the whole situation was there, but they spent a day in the class, and when it was our period for class, we went and had a list of questions that we were supposed to practice with saying, we would say the list of questions to them in Japanese just to practice saying it, and then they would like laugh at us because we were terrible at it. And they're probably much better studies than we are in just North America in general, I think. And then they would practice saying, I assume, if I remember correctly, it would have been the same list of questions back to us just to practice their English. And like they were like 9 times out of 10 times out of 10 had it perfect, and we were struggling through, like, as soon as we were talking with somebody else that actually knew the language, we got like a little embarrassed and uncomfortable and unsure of what we thought that we remembered. And and so I think it would just take something like complete immersion where there is no way out, or an effort to make that a repeated process so that you get comfortable with it. And I wonder often if maybe that's how I felt when I was first starting to talk or put together sentences. You know how there's kids that are like unwilling to talk for like a lot longer than the parents are like, well, he's old enough or she's old enough to be able to talk now. And they just haven't quite gotten around to doing it yet. Like, I wonder if some of that is like a really preliminary version of stage fright. Like, you have thoughts swimming around in your head and feelings and emotions, but you can't fully express those properly yet. And so to do that even in English, when you're surrounded by people who can do it much better than you, I wonder if that's like a very rudimentary example of that. But yeah, like Greg was saying, it seems like most other countries at least put the effort into knowing a bit of English, you know, just in case they have to do anything, even in their own countries. It's like, yeah, it's mandatory. You know, we take a second language from the time we start elementary school or whatever. And so, yeah, it's a very different life that we have here, where we're in North America. We're in a first world country. We're privileged to be able to pick and choose what we want. And the first time you see a cereal box with French above the English and you get all weirded out and you realize, oh, that's just the only way that they could incorporate the Olympics logo very well onto this special edition of Cheerios. Everything's fine. They're not taking over.
Taking over.
Yeah, it's quite a shock. And I think that it's a great idea to be able to connect with other people if we can. Holly and I have a lot of neighbors that guaranteed at least 50 to 60% of them have a language other than English as either their original language or a language they learned at the same time as English. Like guaranteed. And so, yeah, just thinking about, meeting them and getting to know them, or getting to know your neighborhood, or you're just a random person in the grocery market that's asking for help for something or whatever it is.
Although you can't just go up to somebody and start speaking another language thinking that they can understand you, because that's also rude.
Well, no, but I mean, like, if somebody did that to me, it would be really cool if I was able to just help them, right?
Yes, it's very cool when it works out, not so cool when it doesn't work out. Like asking a lady when she's due. It's okay when it works out, and it's not okay when it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
There's an older gentleman at my workplace that got a call from some telemarketer, but we get a lot of equipment from China at my workplace. And so he was like, I don't know what this is. Is it important? I don't know. But they had left a message. And so he came in, and my intern at the time, she was from China and did happen to know, I think, a little bit of both Mandarin and Cantonese. But regardless, he just walked in, had never met her before, and said, "Can you translate this? What is this person saying?" And she was like, okay. And she was able to help him. She was like, "They want your money? Like, they just want, it's a scam call." But when he left, she was like, "I've never met that man before." She was like, "This was really odd that he came and just assumed that I could speak this." Because, like, what if she grew up in Canada and had the same experience here as we did? Just knowing English, it's less likely, sure, but yeah, I was just like, oh, that's something I never had to really think about, I guess, before that experience.
As the years go on, it'll become more and more likely, though, because a lot of people will, like, they're second, third, fourth generation Canadians, right? So, and it's going to be more likely that they won't know the language, their original language, so unless their parents make an intentional effort to pass it on. But I think just in regards to, like, comfortability of language, I do feel a part of it comes from, like, how you're taught, because this was one of the interesting things. Like, I listened to a podcast episode recently in regards to, like, biblical languages like Hebrew and Greek, and how there's the traditional way of teaching where it's, like, very, like, explicit in terms of, okay, here's all the rules, here's all of the terms for all of the rules, and here's how you memorize these verbs or whatever, right? And kind of everything's labeled and everything's really nice and kind of structured and everything. But the person on the episode was saying that she was like, but that's actually not how language works. Like, language is a lot more fluid. It's a lot more, it doesn't actually stick to rules as neatly as we like. And so while having that explicit way of learning can be somewhat helpful, like, you as an English speaker, you have no idea what an imperative is, do you? Do you guys know what an imperative verb is?
A verb where you're telling someone else to do something?
Dang it. All right. Let's try a different one.
I was going to say, I feel like I do.
What about
now I'm questioning everything. Greg seems so confident.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's also how I felt.
I didn't necessarily know what it was. How about an infinitive construct?
Like something that goes on and on forever?
Like a Mobius strip?
What is an example of an infinitive construct in English? What word? I'm not going to...
A British Mobius strip.
No. That's, I know you're trying to make a joke. It's not working, though. I'm not falling for this. What would be an example of a word that's in an infinitive construct? See, now you're analyzing the word infinitive construct, trying to figure out, okay, how does this, right?
Well,
exactly.
It seems like something that should go on and on forever. Or something like that picture where there's stairs and the top of the stairs is the bottom of the stairs. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. No,
you're thinking infinite.
Yeah.
I feel like an infinitive construct is like a word like judgment.
Nope.
That would be like
going to say a word like
abstract
infinity.
That's good. That is a good guess. So it would be like a word like judging that doesn't have an end, that continues on forever. Right?
Oh, I see.
So so the visiting of the man or something, right? So things like that. So that would be So things like you have that, or I guess that would be the construct side of things. So anyway, so you have those terms that really, when I say the example, then it's like, okay, I kind of get where that's coming from. But you in no way, when you said, I will be eating tonight, that you were thinking, oh, that's an infinitive verb. You weren't thinking that. You're just like, that's what we'll be doing, right? So, And so when we use language, we don't think in terms of how things are categorized. We just speak it just from our intuitively,
heart.
Right? Sorry?
I said from our heart.
Yeah, from our hearts, exactly. So that's where an immersive, kind of more French immersion side of things, like that sort of, but even that, I wouldn't even say that French immersion is actually true immersion. What I've heard is the best way to learn a language is go fly to a country, land there with hardly any money, and that will be how you'll be able to learn the language really fast, is because you're going to be required to actually speak to people in their language and learn and get a job and all of that, right? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Seems dangerous.
So, yeah.
Seems risky.
See, and that's why
I get taken.
Yeah. But that's why, I think comfortability comes, when I'm just trying to remember, okay, what was that rule and how do I say this correctly? And, I'm constantly trying to reorder things and figure out how did this verb paradigm work? I'm not confident speaking Hebrew. I've taken now 5 months of it, and you ask me to give you a phrase. And I'm like, I don't know. Can you give me an hour for me to write stuff out? And so, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's where, but when it becomes more internalized and when and I don't know how to get through that, but because the traditional way of learning languages doesn't really allow for that easily. So, but.
Well, and you can't do immersion of biblical Hebrew, because it doesn't exist.
It's true. So, yeah.
I would say that probably they both have their place, though. A constructed traditional way of teaching can give you at least the base for when you go to another country and then you are immersed in it. So people don't always follow the rules in language. English is an excellent example. And even the way that we learned French in high school or in elementary and high school was an excellent example, because they would be like, okay, this is the rule in grade 2. And then in grade 3, they would go, this is the rule, but these are the exceptions. And then in grade 4, they would go, so that wasn't really a rule. This is the actual rule. And then in grade 5, they'd go, these are the exceptions to that rule.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, no. But at least knowing all of those things when you go to a different country and get immersed in it, you can piece together the sentences. Like I was saying, I can read sometimes in Spanish. Then you at least know what someone is talking about, even if the only vocabulary you have are the nouns in the sentence. Right? So I do think that they're both probably important, but I don't think that you get the confidence without the immersion. I think you're right.
Mm-hmm. I think another interesting part of language is the translation side of it. And being in biblical studies, you kind of get exposed to a lot of that. But when translating a language into another, so our English translations of the Bible, that's a pretty clear example where you have there's a bunch of different translations, right? And how certain choices get made. I've heard that like whenever you are translation is always interpretation in some way.
Yeah.
Because you're always having to make choices to fit into your paradigm of your language, which is interesting because and so like that's why like there's been a couple interesting authors who have done like single authors who have done translations. One, Robert Alter, he did a translation of the Old Testament and actually purposefully made it so that it was written more artistically in terms of how it would have been presented back then. So like the King James version of the Bible is very artistic. Like it's kind of nice to listen to in a way. Like it's hard to understand, but it's nice to listen to in some ways because it has that kind of tries to keep more of the lofty, high, I don't know, artistic side of the Bible. And so that's what he did with his translation, was trying to keep it more to that artistic side of it and allowing it to have that. And then even there's a translator for the New Testament, David Bentley Hart, who he made it so that anytime the Greek was bad in the original language, he'd do bad Greek or bad English in his translation. So like Mark, the Gospel of Mark is like not as well written. So then he would make it so that it's not as nice sounding, whereas like the book of Hebrews though is really nice sounding. So that's like way more, he'll write it way more loftily and stuff like that. So
he didn't correct their grammar.
Correct. Yeah. And actually
That's funny.
There's a thing what happens when you past tense. So a lot of times narrative is written in past tense. So like Chris logged on to Skype, he started the podcast and he did it with a bunch of languages that was confusing to all of us here. You listener will get the experience of the polished version of that.
Yes.
So but in Greek, what sometimes happens is it'll switch to present tense all of a sudden. So it'll be like Chris logged on to Skype. Chris starts the podcast. He says, and then it might switch back to past or whatever. And Chris played the languages and they speak really interesting, and so, yeah. And so he'll actually keep that side of things because what it does is it makes it so that you're more invested, I guess. Sometimes it sounds a little weird, but all of a sudden it puts you in the scene as it's like present tense and it's like, oh, I need to pay attention now. So, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting that it was for a purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes I edit papers for people and that's one of the biggest things that I take my red pen and I'm like crossing things out and circling them and I'm in big capital letters. Watch your tense. Pick a tense and stay with it. I don't care which one it is. Just pick one.
Yep. Mm-hmm. I guess you can encourage them, just be like, go into Greek and then you'll be fine. You can switch your tense anytime you want. So
you don't have to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, anyways, that was a little biblical nerd aside, but I think it does illustrate some interesting things about language. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the 3 takeaways that we have for today are when it comes to learning a new language or your current language, watch your tense.
Or Holly will come at you with a red pen.
If you want to really, truly want to force yourself into learning another language without having any outs, just move to another country that speaks primarily another language and you'll have to figure it out in order to survive. And then number 3 is that assuming that somebody else that looks like they know another language actually knows that other language is just the same as asking a lady when they're expecting.
That's pretty good. So, life lessons from the Housebound podcast. There we go.
Yeah, if nothing else, life lessons. I do have one last thing here.
This episode was brought to you by Google Translate. Asterisk. Not an actual designation of sponsorship.
Okay. If you grew up learning another language other than the one that you either currently speak or alongside the one that you currently speak, we'd love to hear about that. We'd love to know from our listeners, which from the very few statistics we can see about our podcast, happens to be just kind of randomly all over the world, which is great. I mostly expected it to be North America, but we've got a lot of you that at least once or twice have listened in from elsewhere. So let us know, what you find interesting about listening to a bunch of us English-speaking people talk about something we know very little about. And let us know what languages you speak, because I'm sure we'll be put to shame with the amount of studying that you have put into it over the years versus our distaste of learning colors in French class. You can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We post episode snippets every other week when we don't have an episode on Facebook and Twitter. And Instagram, we just post some announcement-y fun photo things. You can follow us along on any of those social media platforms. You can also email at us at thehouseboundpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you have the Anchor.fm phone app, there's actually a function on there that will let you send us a voice recording up to a minute long. So you can do that. Maybe just send us a voice recording in a different language and make us figure it out. That would be fun.
It's like a puzzle.
And if it's super interesting, we might play it on a future podcast.
Maybe we could make a podcast of us figuring it out.
Like a mystery.
Wow.
Yeah. That sounds fun.
Can everybody introduce themselves in another language, like on the spot? Or would that take some preparation?
Je suis Greg.
Je ne pas Ashlyn.
Or je m'appelle. Je m'appelle Greg Reimer. Yeah, I have a bunch of random phrases in my back pocket, but I won't pull them out. It's too random. So
please say one.
Say one?
Yeah.
One.
Yeah. واحد.
You're hilarious.
ثلاثة أربعة خمسة ستة سبعة ثمانية تسعة.
I can count in a lot of languages. I don't know why I can count only. French, Spanish, English, German, Japanese.
Yep.
I think that's all of them.
Yeah, I can't even count in Cree. My Cree knowledge is nothing. That's too bad.
Well, if you don't lose it, you'll lose it. So that's another
I
tip of the day.
never even learnt it in the first place.
There we go.